All right, this is AP Lit. We're looking at the second part of the PowerPoint. Judge Irwin, he has character, but don't forget that of the student who said she didn't like any of the characters. I do like them, in spite of the fact that none of them, including him, are perfect. Even suggests that there. Sadie Burke, kind of one of my favorite characters too, because she's the one that's physically, at least beauty-wise, flawed. She had it's a tragic story in childhood, having smallpox. By the way, that was a vaccine. I got the smallpox vaccine, and literally, if you got the vaccine, you did not get smallpox. If you got the polio vaccine, which I did, I knew a student at growing up in school, and she joked about it. She had polio. She said she was the last girl alive who had polio because nobody got it after you took the vaccine. I mean, it eliminated the opportunity, zero chance. Those were vaccines. And so anyway, no vaccine. She got smallpox, and it flawed her. But just like every other character in the book, she's fascinating because although she's physically flawed, her face has the remarks or the results of the smallpox. She's physically attractive to many men. And she's also got a toughness and intensity. She's technically, officially, Willie's secretary, but she's really his chief of staff. I mean, the guy that, she is the one that gets all the, she's smart political. She's a smart cookie, as they used to say. Tiny Duffy, he's also an interesting character. He's really an enemy of Willie, or at least had been in Willie's early life. And what does Willie do? He appoints him, he runs with, I don't know how they do it at Louisiana, but he becomes Willie's lieutenant governor. And have you ever heard the expression, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer? That's kind of Willie's philosophy. He doesn't trust Tiny, so he keeps him as close as he can to keep an eye on him. Sugar Boy's a very one-dimensional character in many ways. He's the bodyguard, he's the chauffeur. He stutters. He rarely speaks at all. When he does, he stutters. But he loves Willie as a father. And then Cass Mastern, he is an ancestor of Jack Burton, who lived during the Civil War, and he has a connection with the story. You have to figure out, what is this story? It's like an entire chapter. My favorite chapter in the book, it's the most tragic. It's a book in itself, but it does relate to the rest of the book. You have to figure that out. He's one of the few people in the book who does something bad. Everybody does something bad, but he does something bad and tries to make up for it. Remember the purgatory thing? At the beginning, the quote from Purgatory, that's what purgatory is about. It's about people making up for what they did. Protestants, we don't believe in purgatory, but it's an interesting idea. So the setting, it is the South during the 1930s, which is the Depression era, and it's Louisiana. Doesn't say that one time in the book, but we know it is because it's about Huey Long. Mason City is, I think, in one scene. He may have mentioned it a couple other times, but the first chapter basically takes place in Mason City. That's Willie's hometown, and his father still lives there. Burden's Landing is where Jack Burden lives. The town's named after his family, but it's also where Ann and Adam Stanton live, and their father was governor of the state at one time. So we're talking about a group of people that are in the high echelon of social and political power in Louisiana. One name that's not on there that I should have put, and that's Jack's mother. Jack's mother is also a very attractive woman. She must be, because she's had like 4 or 5 husbands. Can't keep a husband. It's not all her fault either. the husbands are flawed. Why can't she pick a good man to marry? I don't know. That's her curse. The South during the Civil War is a setting, the whole Cass Mastern chapter. And then the capital city, I don't think it ever mentions Baton Rouge, but that's what it is. Willie's son plays for the State University football team, which would have been LSU. And it's convenient that the capital city is there. I mean, the capital is there, so he can watch his son play anytime he wants to. It's a big book to really take place in not that many places. You know, it essentially takes place in a handful of locations. Symbols. The opening chapter is the only time this is mentioned, but I've always thought it was significant. We're going to read it today, part of it. And it's a highway. And highways, concrete highways, with cars riding on them in the 1930s, that was a kind of a new thing. And he spends a lot of time in detail there. I'd forgotten how much until I read it to the class this morning. But it represents something. Highways and rivers always represent something, you know, connection with, it connects things. Highways, rivers, bridges, they connect things. So they serve that purpose, and you know, they also serve the purpose of travel, and that can be symbolic, to escape and movement. Like, remember Clifford Pynchon, to him the railroad represented travel, and that a modern man can be a nomad, like the ancient man, but now is more convenient and comfortable. You'll learn about this, I think it's in the first or second chapter. An event took place at a schoolhouse, and I think I said this one, fire. There's no fire, there's a fire escape that collapses, and actually several children were killed. And it's the event that catapults Willie into politics. It makes Willie's career. This tragic, again, the irony of that this tragic event is what allowed Willie to get into politics statewide. This is a scene, I can think of only two places it occurs, but it's clearly important because it represents the moment that Jack sees Anne as a girl or a woman, not just a buddy, because he grew up with these children when he was a child, and you know, he overlooks her as a girl, and at this moment he realizes something about her, and it happens again in a different location, the same scene, it evokes that scene. So these are the things that you should be looking for. The first time I read House of Seven Gables, I felt like the Pynchon elm was important. It didn't turn out to be as important as I thought, but you need to be alert as you read something new for things that appear to be symbols and may be important. Willie, we already know, is a corrupt politician, but he wants to do something good. He got a good side to him, and so later it's an entire chapter about him wanting to build a hospital. Willie is essentially a socialist. He wants government-paid medical insurance for everybody, and so he wants a hospital built. And it's almost like penance, again, like purgatory. That's what purgatory is. It's one long penance for people that go there when you try to make up for something. Cass Mastern, he is extremely important. Although he appears in only one chapter, he's a relative of Jack and very important. And Jack loves to escape responsibility. He loves to run away. And when he does so, he goes and finds a motel room somewhere and sleeps for 24 hours and then leaves and gets out of the system. But sleep, if you think about it, is an escape. People that are depressed often sleep it off. Sometimes I would think it would keep you up at night, but he's depressed. When he is like that, he gets lots of sleep. All right, got everybody's attention. Make sure you're paying attention to me. All right, Tom Tallis has a baby. Tom is his Willie's son, and it doesn't appear until later in the book, but it clearly it's an important symbol. You'll recognize it. The West. It's interesting. Today, people are leaving the West. People are leaving California, Oregon, and Washington, and they're moving to Idaho, and they're moving to Texas and Florida. But up until recently, the West was just the opposite. People would leave everywhere else to go out west because it represented unlimited opportunity, and that's what it represents here. Jack takes a trip out west really quickly, but he clearly sees the West as, and America's always been that way. One thing that was attractive about America, if you failed in one place, you could always go west, because there was this almost an unlimited supply of land that you don't have to work for anybody. You know, you can work for yourself. You can build your own life out there. We've lost that. There's still plenty of land out there, but not all of it is habitable. But the West has always been a symbol of, even though it's where the sun sets, you could use it as a symbol of death, which Lord Tennyson does in Ulysses. It's a poem we'll read. But for America, it's been a symbol of hope. The Big Twitch, that's an interesting theory that he loves coming up with these crazy theories, but I think it's significant. I won't go into it now. Basically, he sees a guy filling his car with gas, which doesn't happen anymore, but in the old days, the attendant would fill your car, and the guy has an eye that just twitches, and he takes that, it's involuntary, and he takes that and makes this big theory about human behavior. It's involuntary. That's one of his ways of avoiding responsibility. Oh, you're not responsible for that. You know, you don't have to be responsible for anything. It's just like instinctive. If it's a physical thing you can't do anything about. Jack's always trying to find loopholes in life, so he doesn't have to be responsible. And finally, I can't remember if this is his house or if it's the judge's house, but there's a room he keeps thinking about. And they live in Burden's Landing, and it's on the Gulf of Mexico. There's a bay there, which is on the Gulf, and he always talks about the long white room and the house by the sea, and I think that's the judge's house. And these are things. Again, hopefully your reading will be better, and you know this has got. I just sense this is important. He keeps repeating it. That's always a sign. All right, those were symbols. Here's some themes. Responsibility, we've already said that. We're trying to avoid it. Idealism, you know, the idea of looking, this is how life ought to be. And you keep, romantics are idealists. To idealize life is what romantics do. Interesting, I think this is one of my favorite because it's an interesting thing. How are facts different from the truth? Well, they shouldn't be. And yet we know that they can be. If you manipulate certain facts, you can tell a lie. If you manipulate them, if you take them out of context, if you put them in a different context, that fact can actually become a lie. That's what Jack does for a living. He takes dirt. He doesn't make up stuff. He doesn't make up stuff about people. He finds real things. He doesn't have to. He always finds something about a political opponent that's real, but that's dirt, you might call it. And they use that dirt in order to blackmail their opponents. That's the way a lot of politics are, and that's the way Willie is. Original sin and the fall of man. If you're a believer, you believe in Scripture, then you will see a book like this that, if ever, mentions God, but gets it right with this. All men are sinners, and we all fall short of the glory of God. That's basically what it says without putting God in there. The book is very true about modern man and woman. This is a very popular method in politics. That is to teach, and I think we do it too. You probably think of ways that we do it. the end justifies the means. So if you have a noble end, like something that's good, it doesn't matter how you get there. I think probably people who cheat have that, they talk themselves into believing, listen, I gotta get this A, and I wanna be a doctor, and that's a good thing. So does it really matter how I get there? Politics are like that, governments are like that. Governments believe, like communist governments, you can kill 1 million people, and a lot of people dead, but it's for a good cause. Stalin once said, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of 1 million men is a statistic. And they would do that. They would allow their people to die in early Soviet Union because of the cause. The cause is greater than. Taking away, even our own country, taking away certain rights is necessary. There's a dilemma. You can't go to church for 4 months. That's a right engraved in the Constitution, but you couldn't go. I couldn't go for 4 months. And yet we put up with it because the end, getting rid of COVID, justifies the means, getting rid of church. And fortunately, it was a short period of time, but how long would you be willing to put up with some of those rights taken away in order for some greater good? That's a tough thing, but that's what governments do. A year ago, literally a year ago today, let's see, we were 7 days away from the presidential election, November 2nd, 2020. So we were reading this book a year ago today, a book about politics in the middle of this incredible political period. But it seemed like every year we read it, there's something political in the news going on. And so this is a book about politics and the corruption of politics, about socialism. I mentioned Willie's Hospital, and we talked about populists and demagogues. And remember we talked about Pride and Prejudice and how one of the subjects was style. I said it's the hardest thing to write about because style includes diction and syntax and content and just about everything. What do we say about the style here? First of all, the narrator is a hard-hitting journalist, a guy who just looks for the facts. And so everything that Jack does and says comes from that point of view, even though he's not always factual and he's not just about the facts. He has a lot of ideas as well. It's personal and conversational. I like it. I'm going to read you a part at the beginning that I think you might find confusing. You say, if the whole book's like this, I don't know if I want to read it. Well, you'll have to make that choice. But I think you've got to look at the whole thing. But I like it. It's personal, not like Hawthorne. Very elevated, very formal. A lot of slang and all of this, particularly of the 40s, because it was written in the 40s. So maybe things we don't say anymore. But the tone is, I think, it's humorous and sarcastic. Now, sarcasm is funny when it's not directed to you. We don't like it when somebody's being sarcastic to us, but you know, when you read it in something like this, I find that it's funny. And then this, we talked about Jack is reflective and thoughtful. He uses lots of concrete details. You'll see that in the first page. The second sentence is like 6 or 10 lines long. So it's a really long sentence, rambling, and almost stream of consciousness, where his writing imitates the way we think. Have you ever noticed that? You'd be thinking about one thing, all of a sudden, how did I get there? How did I go there? And then you go to somewhere else. That's how stream of consciousness. It's kind of fun to write, and we've actually done that before, where you just start writing and see what comes. You're kind of writing down your thoughts. But it's to me, it'd be like speaking in tongues in a church. Nobody can understand it except you. So stream of consciousness here has to be more clear, but it's still sometimes challenging to read. I do have few more of these, and there's a reason why I'm going to show them to you. At first I thought, you really don't need this, but at least part of it I think you will. Also apologize for the fact that I'm going to show you 10 chapters, and your book has only 9 in it, and I'll explain that. I should change that over here, but I'll without being too confusing, I'll try to show you where that shift comes. And all right, so here's the plot summary, and I at least want you to write down this is my title for every chapter. So at least part of it. I think that's helpful. There are no titles, unlike Hawthorne. He gave titles. The first chapter I titled Mason City, and you'll notice the first words of the book are Mason City. So that wasn't too hard. The entire book really takes place there, except for one brief section where they go to Burden's Landing. And I've subtitled it Where It All Began, Past and Present. That actually would be a good summary of the book, because you're constantly going back to the past, back into the present, and so forth. This takes place, by the way, in 1936. Remember, it's a fiction book. It's fictitious. The book is fiction, but in the internal setting of the book, it's 1936. Chapter 2, I called From Idealist to Realist. Basically, it's the rise, that would have been a good, if I was smarter, the rise of Willie Towers. It shows how Willie began his career and how he became the Willie that we know as governor of the state. So you could call it the rise of Willie Towers. He goes from being an idealist to a realist. Chapter 3, I call A Glimpse into Jack's Past and the Corruption of Willie Towers. So we get some background into Jack's own background in Burden's Landing with his mom. But at the same time, we get starting to see now the date is 1939. The story takes place in 1939. First chapter was 1936. And then there's a scene in chapter 2 that goes back to 1923. So it's kind of going back and forth for a reason. So this is about Jack and Willie and the corruption of Willie and what's causing that. Chapter 4 has 2 parts to it. And this is where the difference comes in. In my book, the book that I'm using, because I have all my notes in it, there are 10 chapters in the book. Your book has 9 chapters. And this is where the difference comes. Chapter 4 and chapter 5 in my book become 1 chapter in your book. All right, so chapter 4 is 2 parts at least in the same chapter. Jack's first venture into the past, Taskmaster. That's what he calls it. He didn't label the chapter, but when he starts to narrate this to us, there are 2 ventures into the past. And one is he's doing a dissertation on a family member named Jack Taskmaster who lived during the Civil War. And so that whole chapter, or at least half the chapter, is about Taskmaster. Now the next one is and there are only 9 chapters, so I think this is worth doing to give you kind of an overall view of it. The next chapter would be my chapter 5, is still chapter 4, part 2. So in your book, he doesn't divide it into 2 chapters, just 2 parts within the same chapter. So the second part, he calls his second venture into the past, and that's what he calls the case of the upright judge, which is Judge Irwin. So he investigates Cass's background, which took place in the Civil War, and then he investigates his good friend, Judge Irwin, who's older and a father figure to Jack. So he's older and wiser, but he has to do some investigation because the judge is a political enemy of the boss, and the boss is Willie. And Willie orders him to go. And you'll see this at the very end of the chapter. You'll see this encounter take place. So that's chapter 4. chapter 5, you can make that change, is about Willie's Hospital and Adam Stanton. And I think it's his way of trying to become good again by doing some good. He also is a socialist, and he actually believes in socialized medicine. Chapter 6 occurs after a great trauma in Jack's life, and this is when he goes west. He takes a long trip out to California, spends 2 days, turns around and comes back. But it also, it's related to his relationship with Adam. So that's what I mean by that. And finally, the last part of it, chapter 8 is chapter 7, traveling back east. Jack loses 2 fathers. I won't go into detail about that. I don't want to give too much away, but when he comes back, he has other things he has to deal with. And chapter 9 would be your chapter 8. That tells you a lot right there. We're coming to the end. These at least become shorter. That allows us to read a couple of chapters at the time. The first several, most of the book, the chapter is about 80. That long chapter 4 is almost, I think, over 100 pages. But hospitals, funerals, and cemeteries, that doesn't sound very happy, and it's not. And then the last chapter is, should I say, the happy ending. It's I don't know if you call it happy, but it's a redemptive ending. That's the best we can expect, is for people to learn something, to change. And that's what we have here. So we don't have a lot of time. Maybe that's good. I want to read to you if you have your book with you, I want to just get into the story just briefly. And this is, I think, a hard part to read anyway, so I'm kind of doing you a favor. So if you would turn to the first chapter. And like I said, there's some things here. I'm not going to read out loud. So if you're following, you say, why did he say that word? Whatever you want to call it. I just don't feel comfortable just reading them. So, all right, this is Mason City, where it all began, and this is 3 years in the past, and it's the boss, and that's what he calls him, the boss. I don't think he ever calls him Willie to his face. He calls him the boss. By the way, did you know El Duce? I read this. You know who El Duce was? That was Mussolini. You know who Mussolini was? You ever heard of him? He was the inventor of fascism. He invented the word, I believe. He preceded Hitler by a few years, and they were big buddies at the beginning of World War II. But you know what El Duce means? The boss. So even with that nickname, Robert Penn Warren is reminding us that Willie is kind of a dictator type person. Again, if you want to follow along, it's hard to read because it's just the prose. I like reading. I just don't like reading out loud. Mason City. To get there, you follow Highway 58 going northeast out of the city. And it is a good highway and new, or was new. That day we went up it. And this is a long, notice this long sentence. You look up the highway and it is straight for miles, coming at you, with the black line down the center coming at you. Black and slick and tarry shining against the white of the slab, and the heat dazzles up from the white slab so that only the black line is clear, coming at you with the white of the tires. And if you don't quit staring at that line and don't take a few deep breaths and slap yourself hard on the back of the neck, you hypnotize yourself, and you'll come to just at that moment when the right front wheel hooks over the black dirt shoulder of the slab, and you'll try to jerk her back on, but you can't because the slab is high like a curb. And maybe you'll try to reach the turn and turn off the ignition just as it starts to dive. you follow that? He's talking about driving on this monotonously long highway. We're used to yellow lines. Apparently they're used to black line. Wheels go off the curb because you're getting sleepy. So it's a hypothetical situation. But you won't make it, of course. Then a man chopping cotton a mile away, he'll look up and see the little column of black smoke standing up above the vitriolic, notice the high diction, arsenical, high diction, green, and the cotton rose, and up against the violent metallic, throbbing blue of the sky, and he'll say, Lord God. Hits another one, done hit it. The next man down the next row, he'll say, Lord God, and the first man will giggle, and the hoe will lift up, and the blade will flash in the sun like a heliograph. Then a few days later, the boys from the highway department will mark the spot with little metal square on a metal rod stuck in the black dirt off the shoulder. The metal square painted white on top of it with black skull and crossbones. So they actually mark the spot where accidents take place. Later on, Love Vine will climb up it out of the weeds. But if you wake up in time and don't hook your wheels off the slab, you'll go whipping on into the dazzle. And now and then the car will come at you steady out of the dazzle and will pass you with a snatching sound as though God Almighty had ripped the tin roof off with his bare hands. Way off ahead, you at the horizon, where the cotton fields are blurred into the light, the slab will glitter and gleam like water, as though the road were flooded. You ever notice that on the highway? I always noticed it as a kid when you're not driving, you're just looking. And right up there, the end of the highway, as you travel, it gets kind of like wavy. You know, the air is sort of wavy, and it looks like there's water in the road or something, but it's not. It's just the heat coming off the highway. You go whipping toward it, but it'll always be ahead of you because you never get it like a rainbow. You keep after you think you got it, but that bright flooded place like a mirage. You go past the little white metal squares on the metal rods with the skull and crossbone on them to mark the spot. Notice he points out there are a lot of these little markers indicating where people probably died in automobile accidents. For this is the country where the age of the internal combustion engine has come into its town. Has come into its own. Where every boy is Barney Oldfield. He was one of the first race car drivers. I don't know if you ever heard the name. And the girls wear organdy and baptiste and eyelet and embroidery and not something else on account of the climate, and have smooth faces to break your heart. And when the wind of the car's speed lifts up their hair at the temples, you see the sweet little beads of perspiration nestling there, and they hit low. They sit low in the seat with their little spines crooked, and their knees bent high toward the dashboard, and not too close together for the cool, if you could call it that, from the hood ventilator, where the smell of gasoline and burning brake bands and red eyes sweeter than myrrh, where the 8-cylinder jobs come roaring around the curves in the red hills and scatter the gravel like spray. And when they ever get down on the flat country and hit the new slab, God have mercy on the mariner. Own up, number 58, that's the highway. And the country breaks. The flat country and the big cotton fields are gone now. And the grove of live under the oaks way off yonder, where the big house is, and the whitewashed shacks, all just alike, set in a row by the cotton fields, with the cotton growing up to the doorway, where the pickaninny sits with a black billiken and sucks at some and watches you go by. That's all left behind now. It's red hills now, not high, with blackberry bushes along the fence rows and blackjack clumps in the bottoms, and now and then a place where the second growth pines stand close together if they haven't burned over the sheep grass, and if they have burned over, they are black stubs. The cotton patches cling to the hillsides, and the gullies cut across the cotton patches The corn blades hang stiff and are streaked with yellow. I'll just read a little more. There are the pine forests here for a long time, but they're gone. The guys got in here and set up the mills and laid the narrow gauge tracks and knocked together the company commissaries and paid $1 a day, and folks swarmed out of the brush for the dollar, and folks came from God knows where, riding in wagons with a chest of drawers and a bedstead canted together in the wagon bed, and 5 kids huddled together, and the old woman hunched on the wagon seat with a poke bonnet on her head and snuff on her gums, and a young one hanging onto her. The saws sang soprano, and the clerk in the commissary passed out the blackstrap molasses and the sawbelly and wrote in the big book, and the Yankee dollar and Confederate dumbness collaborated to heal the wounds of 4 years of fratricidal strife, and all was merry as a marriage bell. Till all of a sudden, there weren't any more pine trees. They stripped the mills. The narrow gauge tracks got covered with grass. Folks tore down the commissaries for kindling wood. Wasn't any more $1 a day. The big boys were gone, with diamond rings on their fingers and broadcloth on their backs. A good many of the folks stayed right on and watched the gullies get deeper into the red clay, and the good hands of these folks and their heirs, and a sign strayed in Mason City, 4,000 of them more or less. And I gotta stop, but you get a sense, it's not all like this. I think this is the hardest part to read. I like the conversation better, but you're in for an interesting treat. You got about 70, 80 pages, I'm not sure, to read from Monday. Make that Tuesday. And I will, just reserve the possibility of a quiz.